Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. Can you hear me? Welcome to the third and final event in our series of lectures on academic freedom. Welcome also to the Annual Lindner Lecture on Ethics. Two descriptions, but one exciting event. And if one event of this kind is not enough philosophy for you, you may also join us tomorrow in Scoville Hall, 105, at 11 a.m. for a critical panel on tonight's lecture. Participants will include tonight's speaker, Professor Robert B. Talisse of Vanderbilt, another distinguished visitor, Professor Wendy Salkin of Stanford, and our own Professor of Philosophy, my colleague, John Rudisill. Please feel free to join us for this event, too. They're both public. These events are only possible courtesy of the Lindner Endowment, created through the generosity of Carl H. Lindner of Cincinnati, Ohio. This was founded for the primary purpose of engaging our students in special opportunities to bring in, special opportunities for ethical reflection and ethical learning. For nearly 20 years, it's been our custom to bring in extraordinary philosophers to, in a public forum, address us on ethics broadly construed. We're very grateful for this. We're also grateful to our own Emeritus Professor of Philosophy, Hank Kruzman, for his vision and sustained efforts in making this series of events a reality for our students. This particular version of the Lindner Lecture is focused on academic freedom and its related responsibilities. This is regrettably a very timely topic. For academic freedom is at present, as you surely know, being aggressively eroded, infringed, and effaced here in the US and indeed around the world. Previous speakers in this series have introduced us to different aspects of this disturbing reality. Tonight, we'll be invited to reflect on some of its philosophical dimensions. It must also be said that this situation in the academy is not the most disturbing or grotesquely wrongful dimension of our present political life. In particular, as I see it, here in the US, we're living through an unprecedented, extra-legal, hateful exercise in aspirational right-wing authoritarianism. If indeed you see it this way too, I encourage you to make your voice heard, exercise your First Amendment rights. For example, at the No Kings rally being held here in Wooster at the town square and around the country on Saturday starting at noon. Tonight, however, we have the privilege of doing some philosophy together, and we can expect no better guide to the philosophical intricacies of the issues around academic freedom and democracy than tonight's speaker. Robert B. Talisse is an American philosopher and political theorist of international renown. He is currently W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. He earned his PhD in philosophy from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in 2001. His principal area of research is political philosophy, with a particular emphasis on democratic theory and the civic responsibilities of citizenship. You can frequently find his incisive and thoughtful writings in a public-facing register on the website 3 Quarks Daily. Among his many other major works, Talisse recently published Civic Solitude, Why Democracy Needs Distance with Oxford University Press. This is the third treatise in a trio of recent works published with Oxford in recent years. And this is only to mention the most recent of his prodigious and sterling philosophical writing. He has very, very many published works. I commend them to your close attention. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you for joining us tonight. So the talk is called Academic Freedom and Academic Responsibility. And we're going to start. Oh, let me get this turned on, sorry. No. One thing that we might do before I start talking about the topic, which is, as the title indicates, the responsibilities that accrue to academics in light of the freedoms that they enjoy in their professional role. It might help to just sort of establish what's on the agenda and what's not on the agenda. So for tonight's talk, I'm not going to be talking about the topics related to the limits of the freedom the latitude that accrues to academics in light of their professional role with respect to their research, teaching, and other kinds of activities. I'm also not going to talk tonight about the institutional norms that should guide our institutions of higher learning and their leadership in protecting those freedoms. And I won't have much to say about the roles of the people who hold positions of academic leadership, the kinds of organizations that fund academics research, and our own government. I'm going to assume, that is, that we had reached at some point, hopefully not too distantly in the future, of having reached some pretty plausible conceptions of how to think about these three issues. What's on the agenda for tonight is the kind of question that I think lingers even after we've answered the questions that I've identified as not being on the agenda. That's the question of, given that the academic function, given the democratic function of academic institutions, and given that that function explains why professors enjoy a remarkable amount of autonomy in their professional roles, what are the correlate responsibilities that fall to professors given their position in an institution whose job it is to further democracy in some sense that I hope to make clear tonight, and given the fact that in order to enable professors to perform that democratic function, they also enjoy a certain set of freedoms. So I'm interested, that is, as the title suggests of the talk, I'm interested in the responsibilities that go along with academic freedom. Here's the agenda for tonight. We're going to move very briskly through 4 topics, and I'll tie them together. Obviously, since I claim that the question of the responsibility of academics in part is tied to the idea of the democratic function of institutions of higher learning, I want to start off by saying some things about democracy, and in particular, I wanted to identify democracy with a particular kind of ideal. From that ideal will emerge a 2-pronged conception of what our duties are as citizens. I don't intend this analysis of our responsibilities as citizens to be exhaustive. I just want to say that these are 2 central, perhaps they're especially important facets of our civic responsibility. From there, I want to raise a problem that emerges within our role of citizen that has to do with a phenomenon that I'll call polarization, although I'll be using that word in a way that might be a little bit different from how you're used to hearing it used. In particular, I'm interested in pointing out a kind of problem that lurks within our responsibilities as democratic citizens. I want to suggest that as democratic citizens, our responsibilities come in 2 general categories, and these 2 categories of responsibility don't always sit well together and can sometimes conflict, so that the task of being a responsible citizen is in part the task of managing a certain kind of tension or conflict within the norms and responsibilities of the citizen. And I want to suggest that polarization, in the special sense that I'll be talking about it and will explain in a moment, sort of makes this management task very, very difficult, and difficult in ways that are unique, that I think helps us get a handle on what professors, particularly in their role as instructors, as teachers, what professors' responsibilities are. That's the way the talk's going to go. It's very brisk, I realize, and I'll be moving quickly just to cover a lot of ground. Happy to answer any questions that may come up along the way. So when we think about democracy, we're often thinking, immediately about the institutions that are typical of democracies. We think about elections and campaigns, and maybe we think about constitutions and norms regarding the rule of law and an independent judiciary, separations of powers, and these sorts of things. All that makes good sense because these institutional forms of democracy are very present in our political lives. But institutions are tools, and if we want to understand what democracy is, looking simply at the institutions is always going to be unsatisfying, because we're going to need to give an account of why those particular institutions are characteristic of democracy. That is, if we think, once we realize that institutions are tools, we say, what are those institutions for? And the answer to that question, I think, is a better way of trying to get a handle on what we're talking about when we're talking about democracy. We might say then that the reason why institutions and practices like elections and principles regarding an independent judiciary and certain kinds of individual freedoms and the separation of powers and all the rest loom so large in our political thinking is because those are the institutional manifestations, I want to suggest to you, of a particular kind of social ideal. In particular, it's an ideal that I want to identify as an aspiration. That is to say, I want to suggest to you that democracy is fundamentally an aspiration. Particularly, it's the aspiration to achieve a self-governing society of citizens who regard one another as political equals, even though they disagree about politics. That is to say, in a democratic society, we don't simply have to regard one another as people who get an equal say in decision-making with respect to central matters of our political world. We have to see one another as individuals who are entitled to an equal say, even when, perhaps especially when, we see one another as mistaken, sometimes in profound ways, in our political judgments. That is to say that in a democracy, citizens have sort of a two-part civic responsibility that we might think of in terms of sort of a horizontal and a vertical aspect. In a democracy, as a self-governing society, in a democracy, citizens have the responsibility to participate in the activities that contribute to the governing of the society. They have the responsibility to not merely be passive or merely be patients in politics, but to play an active role. And that playing of an active role will include sort of familiar responsibilities to be involved, to build coalitions, maybe to do some of the things that we were just mentioning, protest, hold government to account, have your voice heard in public and with others. But that's only part of the ideal. It's a self-governing society of political equals. In a democratic society, we also have to understand our equality along this horizontal dimension. We're not merely holding the government to account. We have to hold the government to account in a way that reflects our acknowledgement of one another's equality in the endeavor. That is to say that part of what responsible citizenship requires of us is a level attempt to try, not merely to get our way politically, but to understand the perspectives, the priorities, the ideas, the values of our fellow citizens. Because when democracy makes decisions, there are real winners and losers. And when there are real winners and losers among a community of equals, you have to be able to say something to the losers about why their loss does not make them subordinates, right? That they can retain their equality even when their desired outcome loses at the polls. Now, that's going to require, and democratic theorists, people in my business sort of disagree about how stringent this responsibility is, but it is going to require some level attempt to consult with, perhaps, or at least consider the perspectives of others, especially when those others, or especially with respect to those others, whose political judgment differs from your own in fairly drastic ways. This might involve perspective taking and consulting, and some very popular views in democratic theory. The responsibility to one another involves sort of responsibilities to actually talk to them, not merely find out what they think, but to hear from them what they think. On other kinds of views that are still pretty popular in political theory, our responsibility to one another actually involves something like arguing or deliberating or exchanging ideas and reasons with them. We need not settle the question of how involved this second kind of responsibility is here, though. Simply, we just need to say that, well, in a democracy, we have to take responsibility for the political world of which we are the co-authors, and we have to do so in a way that duly recognizes the equal standing of our fellow citizens who are equal partners in that project of self-government. We might say then that, just to thumbnail these two responsibilities, the responsibility the responsibility for politics requires us to act in various ways, and that often means acting in ways that are collective. But in order to satisfy our responsibility to one another as co-equal partners in the enterprise, we have to be able to reflect, to think, to imagine certain things, to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to try to see things their way, even if we think that they're profoundly mistaken in what they think. Okay. Now note, the issue here is that these two kinds of responsibility don't always sit well together. As many of you may have experienced at various points in your life, perhaps at various points in your life quite recently, the idea that when we're in the throes of politics, and when the questions at stake are very, very important to us, and when it's very clear to us what the right answers are to the political questions that we confront, the idea that we have a responsibility to try to consider the points of view of our fellow citizens who don't see things our way will often strike us as a kind of capitulation to them, will often strike us as a waste of time, will often strike us as conceding ground and strategically undesirable. That is to say that it's not only that these two responsibilities are sort of hard to satisfy together, it looks as if satisfying the responsibility for sort of taking ownership of our politics sort of suggests to us that maybe we don't, or leads us to sort of discount the importance of meeting our responsibility to our fellow citizens, especially when we think our fellow citizens or particular groups of our fellow citizens are not only wrong about the political question, but are wrong and therefore in the wrong about the political questions we face. But still, it seems to us then that maybe even though democracy happens in the streets, like what's going on one side of the slide there, the democratic ethos, the responsibilities of democratic citizenship is also a task within us. It involves trying as best we can to consider why it's not the case that all of our fellow citizens agree with our political judgments, and to try to see where they're coming from, even if we're committed to thinking that those with whom we disagree are making an error, perhaps even an obvious one. Good. Now, the task within us is a management task. It's a task that has to do with sort of coordinating the responsibility to get involved and to be a participant with this other kind of responsibility to sort of step back sometimes and reflect about the questions. And this sort of this coordination task is made much more difficult. It's difficult as it is, but it's made much more difficult by a pretty predominant and prevalent political dynamic that we'll call polarization. Now, I want to distinguish between polarization in a familiar sense, which is not really central to what I want to talk about tonight, and polarization in this sense that's a little bit less familiar, I suspect, to many of you, which is what I want to talk about tonight. And we're going to call the familiar sense of polarization just political polarization, and I'll say what I mean by that in a second, but it'll be familiar to you. This other phenomenon that might be less familiar to you is a different thing altogether, but it's still called polarization. It's called belief polarization. Now, political polarization is the familiar sense of the term polarization, and it literally means sort of what's going on in that picture generally. We talk about political polarization as a metric of the ideological divide between two political units, or two, let's say in the US, parties, political coalitions. Polarization in the political sense is especially pronounced when the middle ground between the contending parties has dropped away. There are no bridge builders, literally as in the graphic there, and the members of the opposing units have sort of pulled and huddled together in their most distant formulations of their position, so that there's very little, not only common ground, but very little ground for productive engagement or cooperation. When political polarization is especially pronounced, democracy suffers because in order to succeed, democratic governance, legislators have to be able to do things, and it's often the case that in order to do things, there has to be some cooperation on the table. When political polarization is especially pronounced, the one side wants the opposite of what the other side wants, but that's not all. The one side takes great pride in wanting the opposite of what the other side wants and comes to see any attempt to cross the divide as a kind of betrayal of one's allies. This is the familiar sense, but it's not primarily what I want to talk about. There's this other phenomenon called belief polarization, and it's different. Belief polarization is not the metric of a divide between two opposing camps. Belief polarization is a cognitive dynamic that occurs within members of a like-minded group, so among allies. So we're not talking about the distance between the opposed parties. We're talking about a dynamic that occurs within each of the parties among the members of the party. Belief polarization is the regularity with which interaction among like-minded people turns us into more extreme versions of ourselves. This is sort of colloquially known as sort of the yes-man phenomenon, but this is an incredibly well-documented cognitive and affective dynamic that occurs in like-minded groups of all kinds. It doesn't have to be political groups, doesn't have to be parties, doesn't have to be groups that are like-minded with respect to some moral or value theoretic goal. If you get a bunch of people together, all of whom agree that Denver, Colorado is notable for being high above sea level, the longer they talk about the elevation of Denver, the higher they say it is. That's the phenomenon we're talking about. This dynamic doesn't differ, doesn't vary significantly in the ways that you think it should. It's no less prevalent among highly educated groups of like-minded people than of groups of like-minded people who aren't highly educated. It doesn't vary with religious conviction, economic positioning, gender, ethnic identity. It's found all over the world, and its features are pretty stable across societies. In fact, the earliest studies of belief polarization come from the 1950s in France. So this is a widely studied, very robust cognitive and psychological and affective dynamic. And what I want to suggest to you is that the thing to recognize about belief polarization is that although it might explain some of what's going on here, it might be part of the explanation of how opposed parties become so divided and acrimonious towards one another, this is actually a dynamic that works within us and doesn't have anything intrinsically to do with our relations to people who are our opponents. That is, what belief polarization does to us, I want to suggest you three things. Belief polarization in making us more extreme, that is, we come to hold a more extreme version of our view, we come to hold it with a greater degree of confidence, and we come to see ourselves as better judges of the issue in question. As we become extreme along those three metrics, we also become more insular. That is to say that our more extreme selves are also more invested in seeing those with whom we disagree as irrational, as incompetent, as dishonest, as in some other way disordered or deranged. And the just so story, the sort of folk theory that you might have about why our more extreme selves are also more insular is probably correct. It's like as we become more confident in our judgment, it becomes harder and harder for us to see how anybody in their right mind could disagree with us. And so as we become more extreme, we become more invested in diagnosing those with whom we disagree as in some way or other, not merely wrong, but cognitively impaired. Similarly, and for much of the same reasons, by the way, when we come to see the in-group as virtuous and the out-group as impaired and deranged, policing the boundary between the in-group and the out-group becomes all the more important to us. So our more extreme selves are also more conformist. That is, as we, with our allies, become transformed into our more extreme selves, we also become more invested in homogeneity among our allies. polarize. Belief polarized groups tend to start dressing alike. They tend to start pronouncing certain words similarly. They tend to use the same words. In the United States today, it's a pretty clear indication, by the way, in case you weren't aware of this, of somebody's partisan affiliation if you just listen to how they pronounce the names of certain other countries. Iraq or Iraq. And I don't have to tell you the partisan breakdown of those two pronunciations of the name of that country, because you know, right? Our more insular, conformist selves are also more hierarchical. That is, as groups become more belief polarized, therefore becoming more extreme, becoming more insular and more hierarchical, holding the group together, having the group remain a group of like-minded people, becomes more and more a matter of establishing within the group a small number, perhaps as small as one, a small number of people who are going to set the standards for authentic membership in the group. Who's going to tell you what the right words are, what the right hats to wear are, what the right pins to wear, what words, how to dress. So our more extreme selves are not only more insular and more conformist, our more extreme selves are also less democratic. Hierarchical groups are not internally democratic groups. They're internally non-democratic groups. Okay. Now, that brings us to our topic. Let me say one thing. Skip this slide. We're used to thinking about polarization, again, because it's associated with what I call political polarization. We're used to thinking about polarization as a kind of don't sweat the small stuff, or always build bridges, or have your political enemies over for coffee and you'll find that they're not so bad kind of story. The kind of story I'm trying to convince you of here is that at least the phenomenon of polarization I'm interested in is not that kind of diagnosis. The problem of polarization, as I'm presenting it to you here, it's not the problem of divisiveness. It's not the problem of animosity across the aisle, as it were. I happen to think that democracy's health really calls for a pretty high degree of animosity and contestation among political opponents. The real problem of polarization I want to suggest to you is that as we shift into our more extreme versions of ourselves, we become less able to satisfy both of the requirements of democratic citizenship. Because what happens as we become more extreme, more insular, more conformist, more hierarchical, is that not only do we come to see our political enemies, our political opponents, as deranged and not worth talking to, we come to see our allies as mere accomplices. We come to see them as the kind of people who need to be kept in line. We become less tolerant of disagreement with our friends. Not only do we become, that is, more hostile towards our foes, we become less tolerant of difference among our allies. And in both of those registers, that's a failure to recognize the equality of our fellow citizens, both our allies and foes alike. But that's only half the story. In heavily belief-polarized contexts, now we're talking about contexts where the belief-polarized units are political parties, right? Or political identities, partisan identifications. In heavily belief-polarized societies, in democratic contexts, belief polarization releases government officials, lawmakers, office holders from all of the traditional democratic theoretic pressures to serve the common good. That is, as we become our more extreme selves, office holders, politicians, candidates, people who are public figures can succeed at what they want to do, win re-election or get elected, get clicks, get followers, get more listeners to the podcast, by playing to, mugging to our partisan attitudes and our patterns of dismissiveness and our patterns of conformity. That is to say that the beneficiaries, we might even say, of polarization in the sense I've been suggesting to you are the people with the power to do something about it, right? We, in the United States, lots of stuff has happened in the United States in the past 40 years. One of the things that's happened is that we as a society have become more and more accepting of the idea that it is central to the job of an elected official, especially in high-profile political roles, that it's essential to their job, if not their number one job, is to win re-election for themselves and for other members of their party. That is, that the idea that getting elected to a public office involves public service has become in the United States since the late 80s a lower and lower priority in our understanding of what elected officials are supposed to do. It turns out that when an electorate is heavily belief polarized according to partisan identities, all the work of the campaign management and the handlers and the candidates becomes very, very easy. Stoke animosity. You don't have to actually serve the public good to get reelected in the United States. You just have to make the people who are likely to vote for you, if they vote, angry enough to get out and vote. It's a mobilization game. But if democracy is simply about mobilizing people on the basis of their disgust with, animosity towards, distrusting attitudes with respect to anybody who's not just like themselves, the democratic aspiration has been lost. Okay. Last thing about this. Part of the story of the ways in which belief polarization has become rampant in democracies, but all over the world, but perhaps especially the United States, is that one of both the byproducts and the sort of ways in which belief polarization perpetuates itself is that in the United States today, not only the United States, but in the United States today, more and more of the social spaces that we inhabit in our day-to-day lives are segregated according to partisan identification. The chances of running into a conservative voter in Whole Foods are really, really low. The surest indicator, one of the most reliable predictors of whether you voted for John McCain is how close you live to a Cracker Barrel restaurant. Think about the difference between a Starbucks and a Dunkin' Donuts. And when I say this, you're going to say, oh yeah, that's got to be right. The chances of running into a conservative voter in a Starbucks are really low. Meanwhile, think about the Dunkin' Donuts slogan for the past 25 years. America runs on Dunkin'. Right? Starbucks is selling you the illusion of being in a foreign country and speaking a foreign language. Having a passport and traveling abroad is much more prevalent among liberal voters, by the way. Dunkin' Donuts is not selling you those things. It's selling you sugar and caffeine to get you to and from work. That is to say that part of what goes on in belief polarization is belief polarization has the tendency, because of the hierarchical and conformist elements of it, to transform anything in its vicinity into an expression and signal of partisan identity. The number of tote bags you have positively correlates with liberal voting patterns. And the same goes in the other direction for camouflage. Okay. And that's, you already know stuff about sort of hybrid cars and pickup trucks, but it's, let me put it this way before moving on. I promise I'll be quick about this. You're familiar, I think, with what strikes me as a pretty compelling argument about part of the danger for democracy about social media and online spaces generally. And that sort of familiar argument, sometimes associated with Cass Sunstein, is the argument that says that, well, what goes on in these sort of online spaces is that people are able to pre-select and filter out anything that isn't going to just bolster what they're already inclined to think and feel. That is, as Sunstein puts it, the internet just allows us to hear louder and louder echoes of our own voice. And that's problematic because we get a distorted sense of what other people think, we get a distorted sense of what's thinkable, we tend to overestimate the amount of evidence that favors the thing that we already think because we hear more and more people telling us that we're right all the time. That seems to me like a pretty good argument about one of the dangers of what goes on in social media spaces and maybe online in general. The lesson here I'm just sort of suggesting to you is that physical environments are structured in the same way and often by the very same forces. And insofar as interaction among like-minded people exposes us to belief polarization, our day-to-day lives place us within these filter bubbles and echo chambers that make us less good at democratic citizenship. Okay, academic responsibility. Now, I want to much of what I'm going to have to say here, I think, it will strike at least many of you as sort of commonplace. I don't think it's such a bad thing for a philosopher to repeat the commonplace. But I'm hoping at the end to work up to something that will strike you as counterintuitive. I hope maybe it'll strike you also as, despite its counterintuitivity, possibly true, but and maybe we won't get that far. So there are two sort of popular views that are popular in political commentary, at least, about a professor's work, particularly in the classroom, but perhaps not only there. Some people think that a professor's work has to be apolitical, and there are other people who think that it has to be political. And I'm not too concerned with the idea that a professor's work should be apolitical, because I think that is not a coherent view to have about what goes on inside institutions like institutions of higher learning. The reason why we think as a society that learning is important has something to do with politics. And so the idea that the professionals who are in roles to facilitate that thing that we think is important for politics have to be themselves in their doing of that thing apolitical doesn't strike me as I just don't know. I don't know what it could mean. That is, I think, that the only way to explain why our society invests so many resources and so much time and effort into educating people is because we think that, for lots of reasons perhaps, but one of the reasons that we think that it's important for citizenship. So I'm going to stick with the idea that professors' work has to be political, has to involve education for democratic citizenship. Okay, the question then is, what does that mean? And here there are two different views about the idea, regarding the idea that a professor's work has to be political, namely it has to be involved in preparing or helping or cultivating the attitudes appropriate for democratic citizenship. And there are two visions that are often seen as stark opponents in these debates, and I want to suggest to you that they have a certain thing in common that makes them much more similar than their proponents recognize, and I think the thing that they have in common also makes both of these views inadequate. A traditionalist view of a professor's job, at least in the classroom and perhaps beyond, says that part of what professors have to do is promote in students the habits and dispositions and attitudes that have to that go into or reflect sort of a positive assessment of the country, so that, the story might run, so that they can become active participants in continuing that society. In some pretty extreme versions of this that you sometimes hear trotted out by the current administration, the thought is that it's the job of a professor and of a teacher in general to make sure that their students come to love America. In less, I think, flat-footed and I think more defensible versions of this view have to do with, as Richard Rorty put it, who I count as a traditionalist, oddly, in this argument, that education in a democratic society has to do with inspiring students to see the virtues of the project that that America has been since its founding. Contrast that with a view, again, that's often seen as its polar opposite, but I think has a lot more in common with it along a dimension I'm about to describe, which I'll call presentism. We're not doing metaphysics here, philosophers. This is a different sense of that term. Presentism is the view that says that a professor's job is political, and what that means is educating for democracy, and that means is the job of a professor is to promote the habits and dispositions that reflect the work to be done in a democratic society. That might be consistent with, or that sometimes is sort of travels with, the idea that it's the job of a professor to make sure that students aren't too enamored with the past of the country, that they can see the country has fallen short and is still, in many respects, betraying its own promise. And that, too, is a way of cultivating within students the skills and the habits and the disposition, the temperament to advance, to contribute to participate in a democratic society. Now, I want to suggest to you that what both of these ideas have in common is that they take a view of educating for democratic citizenship that essentially involves a look backward. Either a look backward to make sure that there's a positive assessment, or a look backward to make sure that there's the assessment that's a little bit more realistic and focused on the shortcomings. And what I want to suggest to you is a different kind of approach that is more fundamentally forward-looking. And I want to suggest to you the idea that it's the responsibility of the academic in educating for democratic citizenship to attempt to cultivate the capacities to not only understand and appreciate the democratic aspiration as it's been played out, perhaps in this particular democracy, but to make advances on it, to innovate, to do things new with it. Now, what I want to suggest to you, just to bring this back around, is that both the traditionalist and the presentist view are tethered in a way that is not, I think, not adequately appreciated, are tethered to our existing political idiom, to our ways of thinking about politics. Often they're tethered particularly to particular ways of understanding the proxies that existed in the past for our contemporary partisan divisions. But I want to suggest, because of the polarization stuff that we talked about a moment ago, that idiom, that vernacular of thinking about politics, is partly the product of a set of cognitive and affective dynamics that are fundamentally getting in the way of us furthering democracy. So what I want to suggest then is that we ask the question, so what does it take, not merely to appreciate the democratic aspiration, not merely to understand it, not merely to assess the present of democracy in light of the promise that American democracy was built on. I want to suggest the question really is, what does it take to advance the aspiration? And the hint here is that it takes a recultivation, a reinvestment in imagination and reflection, and maybe a little bit less fixation with political action and collective public activity. Not to say that those things are unimportant, but rather to say that part of what it takes to advance the democratic aspiration is to invest in the cultivation of the imagination of students. That is to say, I want to suggest to you that an academic's responsibility comes to this. It's to equip students to make a democratic future that's fundamentally different from the past and from the present. What that takes, I want to suggest to you, is an engagement with ideas, engagement with material, engagement with stimulants for thinking that are not readily translatable into our contemporary experience of politics. Now, this is the part that I think might strike some of you as counterintuitive, and here's where I'll end. In institutions, and I suspect not only my own, it's not uncommon to hear from leadership and from professors, especially in the humanities, that the future, the way to protect the humanities and protect the aims of a liberal institution and the liberal arts more generally, is to make sure that our teaching, that what goes on in our classroom, our modes of instruction, our syllabi, reflect, speak to the lived experiences of our students. I'm not here to suggest that that's a bad thing. I want to suggest that that's one thing that is good to seek to do. But I also want to suggest that part of the democratic ideal involves engagement with materials, ideas, debates, disagreements, questions that we can only receive as just fundamentally alien to our current situation. Different. Some of you know this. Each year I teach a large political theory course at Vanderbilt, large by Vanderbilt standards. We read Aristotle in that seminar, in that course rather. And almost every semester a student will ask me, perfectly fine question, was Aristotle a conservative? And it's an interesting question because it allows, well, what do you mean by that? What, is it the talk about virtue? Is it, what exactly do we mean by conservative here? It's a perfectly good question. But what makes that an interesting question is that it creates the occasion to help students to see that not every bit of very sophisticated political theorizing is characterizable in the terms of our current politics. Aristotle wasn't a conservative, not because he was a liberal, right? The idea that politics isn't always about us, and that the ways in which we have to train ourselves to innovate and to imagine new ways of thinking about the aspiration to live together in a self-governing community of political equals. That's the thing that I think gets undermined in both the traditionalist and the presentist models. And I want to suggest that an academic's responsibility doesn't involve dismissing all the aims, the worthwhile aims that might exist in the traditionalist and presentist models. It also involves this other thing, exposure to something that's fundamentally alien as a way of helping to spark an imagination that can't readily be translated into our experiences right here and right now. Thank you. I'm just going to stand in case I want to go back to a slide. How's that? Sounds good.
Okay, do we have questions? I'm holding the mic, and I will share it with anyone who has a thought to share. Will.
We'll get the mic to you before you start. And please say your name before you start. Yeah, turn on, yeah. There you go.
Hello.
Oh,
Okay.
whoa.
My name is Will Laubacher.
Mike thinks right.
Yeah, so at the end of the talk, you talk about how traditionalism and presentism aren't necessarily bad in themselves. It's just that it's best for professors to add this additional aspect. Do you see or anticipate any tension between adding that as an additional point of importance for teachers to focus on, just in terms of how we work traditionalism, or work this new approach into what's already emphasized within traditionalist and presentist perspectives?
So, good question. So one way to think about the proposal is that it's in part born out of a kind of frustration I have with some of my colleagues in the humanities, who I think have too quickly sort of signed up to the idea about making the case for the relevance of reading Mary Shelley or something, right? I had one thing that got me thinking of this is hearing a high-level academic administrator in my own university score a lot of points with some of my colleagues by saying in a public forum, it's really important that we have courses where our undergraduates can read Plato's Republic, because I don't know of any other way to better introduce them to the dangers of how democracy becomes authoritarianism than the first book and then 7 and 8 of the Republic. And that was music to a lot of my colleagues' ears. And it's not that I think that this is a terrible thing either. Saying, wait a minute, isn't there some value to Plato to be in that it presents you with a world that doesn't really translate that well, right? And that maybe an important thing to learn about ourselves as democratic citizens is to learn that not everybody is speaking to us all the time. And even sometimes when they are speaking to us, they're not speaking to us in a way that is accessible by means of the vocabulary that is so central to how we think of ourselves right now. And so the thought is simply, maybe this is a crude way of putting it, I think we need, as professors of the humanities perhaps particularly, stand up for our disciplines a little bit more in a way that doesn't sort of make the traditionalist or the presentist argument, but say, wait a minute, part of what it is to be a good democratic citizen is to have encountered the idea that there's lots of ways of thinking about things out there, all kinds of things to think about. And, maybe the idea that, maybe the question, was Aristotle a conservative, shouldn't be so easily formulable by us. Because it might help us to be a little bit more familiar with the thought that, not everybody who's a systematic political thinker fits into any of the boxes that we all currently fit into in one way or the other. And let me just say one reason why I think that this is especially important today. It seems to me that a lot of the political, sort of like policy, legislation questions that we confront as a society, as a democratic society today, part of what makes them seem so intractable, think about environmental policy, immigration policy, right? Sort of stuff having to do with AI and intellectual property issues, certain kinds of intellectual property issues. I think that part of what makes these so intractable, I think, is because some of these issues require us to think about them in ways that go beyond what our familiar political categories allow. I think the environmental issues are really good examples of this. We're trying to figure out what should a particular geographically bounded state do about the environment. Say, okay, that's the way legislation gets made. We don't get to make laws for Canada, right? Okay, I get that. But surely the problem of environmental policy is not bounded by state territories. But all of our political thinking seems to presume that. And that is why I think that some of these issues get so hard to see how any progress can be made in even thinking about them straight. I think the same goes for a certain set of issues with respect to immigration, particularly those issues that have to do with climate refugees, right? You say, well, it's the environmental policies of particular bounded states in particular parts of the world that look like they're causally responsible for creating unlivable spaces in the world that used to be livable, right? So now what do we do about that? And it looks as if, so long as we're tethered to the idea that political thinking comes prepackaged in categories like progressive, liberal Democrat, centrist, conservative, Republican, MAGA, whatever, libertarian, whatever it is. Like this is a political idiom that is the product of, many, many decades where conditions are fundamentally different. And I think the political challenges are different. And I think to contribute to advance the democratic project, it's just going to require just a revision of those categories, not an overcoming of our political foes, that they're no longer people who believe those things anymore, but rather just a change of the idiom. How's that? Is that all right?
Hello. My name is Chris Caldwell. I'm over here. I'm over here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
On the political responsibility, civil responsibility of taking being open to other people's perspectives. What if it's a perspective on humanity, on what makes a person, or what makes a person a citizen of the United States? How should one go about viewing that perspective? If not to say that there is a specific universal truth, but there you could say there are universal truths on what a person is. and that it should be more open on what it is to be a human, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so my question is like, how does one go about that?
Good. Now, I don't know. Let me say one quick thing and then directly answer the question. I give talks about this stuff a lot, and the kind of question you've asked is usually the first or second question that gets asked. It's a version of this. So like, well, do we have to like try to listen to or understand the perspective of Nazis, right? Do we have to try to listen to or understand the perspectives of people who hold political ideas that are fundamentally at odds with the very idea of society as the aspiration for self-government among political equals? I think the answer there is no. I'm not sure exactly whether democratic citizens have any kind of responsibility towards people who hold radically, fundamentally anti-democratic ideas. I don't know what our responsibilities are to them. It might be prudent to try to figure out right, where they come from, to try to hear them out. I don't know that you are obligated to do so. But here's the worry that I want to suggest. I think that our tendency, when we hear someone talk about, I'm sorry, I'm just going to try to bring this slide up really quick. When we hear about this second responsibility, the responsibility to consult with, to consider the perspectives of others, the tendency to automatically introduce the premise that all of my political opponents are totally beyond the pale and probably not worth listening to, that there aren't people with whom you disagree who don't hold these radically beyond the pale commitments. They just think things that you think are false about politics. The tendency to go to have to listen to the person who's the racist, sexist, homophobe, transphobe. I don't know I'm not talking about those people. I'm just talking about the people who are your fellow democratic citizens, who you think are in some significant respect wrong. I think the tendency to think about our political opposition strictly in monolithic terms that paints them all as the most extreme version we can conjure is one of the products of this phenomenon. It is the expression of this idea about insularity. What's on the other side, right? There's the in-group, and then there's the out-group. Belief polarization is the tendency to see the out-group as composed only in monolithic and extremist terms, so that there are no opponents that aren't fundamentally opposed to democracy as such. Now, I just don't think we're there, right? I have lots of disagreements, I'm sure you do too, with people who exhibit many of the same voting patterns I exhibit. We agree about a whole lot. We disagree about immigration policy. And sometimes we disagree about immigration policy in a way that leads me to think, like, you're not thinking clearly about this at all. You're being driven by something that is not rational, not subject to reasoning. The suggestion is you got to try to check that, right? I don't think you have to sit down with the local white supremacist and try to understand their perspective. I think you have to do something to check the tendency within ourselves to treat all of our political opponents as if they were the white supremacists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I get that, but my thing is kind of with not the overtly extremists, but those who are tacitly implicit and perpetuating, those beliefs.
Could you, I couldn't hear exactly, sorry. Could you say that again?
I get that with, the extremists, but I want to understand, with the people who are tacitly, perpetuating the ideologies that some people are subpar or subhuman.
Right.
Like, not everybody is going to express that, just outright. It will be, unconsciously. So,
Sure.
what other ways, like you can talk about that, but
That's right.
you can't. At the end of the day, you can't change people and you can't change their minds. What do you? How can you go about that and be open to their perspectives?
No, that's right. No, this is a deep and important issue. It's just not the issue I'm talking about, right? I'm concerned with the tendency to, because of this cognitive and affective phenomenon, for us to adopt the attitude that democracy is possible only when everyone's just like me. And that we lose the capacity to understand that within the bounds of acceptable democratic opinion, there are lots of politically misguided ideas. We've got to try to understand the perspectives of those who hold those ideas within that spectrum of permissibility. That, you know, here's the sort of like the pill that democracy is not all sweetness and light. The pill of democracy, the hard bullet to bite in democracy is, yeah, in a society of equals, even in a society in which equality is imperfectly realized, one of the upshots of political equality is we each get to think our own thoughts about things. We get to make up our own minds. And so in a democratic society, when it's healthy, there's going to be real disagreements about things that matter among people who hold views that, not that I'm advising the attitude like, well, who knows who's right or who's wrong? No, right? We're disagreeing because we think we know who's right and who's wrong. That's what a disagreement is, right? But rather, the thought is that in a democratic society, there are going to be serious disagreements. And we are subject to a tendency to treat all instances of disagreement as diagnosable in ways that paint the opposition in the terms that you're suggesting, in the terms that you're worried about. It's not that I don't think that the question of what democratic citizens in good standing, how democratic citizens in good standing should comport themselves to overt and covert anti-democrats in our midst. That's an important question. I'm not denying that's an important question. It's just a different question from the question of what do I owe to my fellow citizen who is in good democratic standing, who I just think is wrong. If they get their way, my part of the world that I am responsible for becomes less just. How do I treat them, given that I'm subject to these cognitive and affective phenomena that drive me to diagnose them as beyond the pale and not worth talking to? We can talk more about that if you're around.
Hi, my name is Madeline. Madeline.
Okay, Madeline, yeah.
So I was wondering, you mentioned how basically politically we're so extreme in both directions, and with both political polarization and belief polarization, those extremes become more and more extreme. How do you reach those people and, like, I guess get them to sort of understand this aspect that you have to sort of consider another perspective so that way we don't continue to go down this extreme path?
Well, one thing that I think is worth noting is that the phenomenon of belief polarization is not simply a political phenomenon. So, like I said, if you find it, you get a bunch of people who will agree that the third chair to the right in that row is especially comfortable. You ask them, how comfortable is it? And they'll say, oh, it's a 7 in a scale of 1 to 10. The longer they talk, they start upping their estimation of how comfortable it is. So this is a general phenomenon that's not simply about, or not only about politics. So that's one way you might say, look, we've got some like really good data that shows that we're the kinds of creatures that are susceptible, vulnerable to this sort of weird kind of cognitive and affective glitch. We like to hear the things that come out of our mouths, come out of the mouths of other people. And when they do, we sort of shift into a more extreme version of what we believe. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that is really important has to do with the framing of the question, as you put it. Part of the reason why I think this phenomenon is such a problem and a threat to the democratic aspiration is because it's stealthy. It's hard to see in our own case. So you ask the question, well, what do we do with the people who, are obviously in this condition to get them to see that they're in this condition? I just want to suggest we've got really good inductive reason to think that we're all in this condition, right? This doesn't discriminate. The tendency, let me suggest, and part of what I think makes this phenomenon so widespread is not only that it's stealthy, it's easy to detect in others, hard to detect in our own case. I think that we have a tendency that I think is quite mistaken, but it's very popular. And again, I give lots of talks about this stuff. So it's very popular for people to at least tacitly accept the following thought. Having good political judgment inoculates you against this. And it doesn't, right? It doesn't, right? Being on the right side of the political issues doesn't make you any less susceptible to these kinds of dynamics. If you've ever been involved, as I'm sure many of you have, in a coalition building endeavor, one of the things that's really difficult about building politically effective coalitions is exactly this. Once the coalition starts to congeal and sees itself as coming together, people's groupish tendencies start coming into play. And you start seeing even successful coalitions splinter very quickly over divisions among the allies about what it takes to be an authentic member of the group, what the group's real mission is. Group polarized coalitions often are susceptible to forms of extremification that lead the members to start adding to the remit of the coalition, right? So saying, well, I know we started as a group that was opposed to domestic violence, but aren't we also a group that's committed to the opposition of violence of all sorts? So don't we also have to be vegans? By the way, this is a real story of a coalition I was part of in New York that splintered because the leadership started disagreeing over whether a group that was invested in helping victims of domestic violence de-escalate, learn to protect themselves, learn the legal condition, the legal options that are open to them, very quickly became an internal fight that just ended the group about whether it was possible to have a coalition committed to this service with respect to domestic violence that was silent and therefore complicit on other forms of violence. And eventually people just said, I don't think a coalition can be all these things, and it splintered. And the internal disagreement among the group became intolerable to people. And one of the things that goes on with belief polarization that you might be familiar with if you've ever tried to build a political coalition, and one of the difficulties is that as our groupish tendencies kick in, as these phenomena kick in, the other thing that kicks in is poser detection. Right? People who are members of the coalition get really, really invested in weeding out from the group people who are not into it, not really members. And in heavily belief polarized groups, they often develop an internal vernacular, an internal vocabulary for calling out posers. This is Rhino and Dino, right? Republican in name only, right? Or sometimes on the left, it's neoconservative, is a person who looks like a liberal but really isn't. And so, by the way, also, last thing on this, belief polarization is also highly correlated with something called the black sheep phenomenon. We tend to harbor more intensely punitive attitudes towards perceived posers than the attitudes we hold towards outright foes, right? Being somebody who is a fake member is worse than being somebody who is an opponent to us in belief polarized contexts. So what I want to suggest to you is I think that the thing that I want to suggest is maybe the right place to start is with the realization that we're not invulnerable to any of this ourselves. And maybe that's coloring our ideas about the condition of the people who we see as our political opponents. Now, that doesn't mean that you've got to make nice with them. I think politics is it's contestatory. I think democratic politics is agonistic. It's about antagonisms. So this is not a reach across the aisle and everybody has to be friends in order for democracy to work. I think that's a bad model. I think that no, in order for democracy to work, there needs to be real animosities, but they have to be targeted at the actual things that divide us, rather than targeted at the products of this, rather than targeted at the caricatures of others that we develop in our own minds because of these dynamics. Okay, I'll be quicker, sorry. You're asking great questions, thank you.
Hello? Okay.
Your name?
So my name's Ian.
Ian.
So I'm going to word this, my wording here is going to be pretty intentional because democratization, as political scientists will tell all of us in here, is an ongoing process even once you have a democracy. And your idea of academic responsibility is ultimately about maintaining democracy and improving democracy, and therefore is part of democratization. So the actual question is, what do you think about an academic's responsibility in the process of democratization while in the process of moving away from a recent autocracy or non-democratic system within a country?
Yeah, this is again, this is a great question, and I don't know the answer, right? So the way I would try to situate the kind of account I've offered here is this is an account of sustaining democracy, right? I think that you're right to point out or to have perceived that the project is that democracies don't get established. They're works in progress. They have to be maintained. They have to be sustained. There are things that we have to do to keep them going and to make sure that they're fueled and moving in the right directions. The question of how to make a democracy out of a political condition that is overtly autocratic. I don't know the answer to that question.
My name is Sohail. My question was, if the democracy's crisis is also the crisis of imagination, then how can education help people think in new way without breaking the basic understanding that holds a country together?
Can you say the last part again without breaking the
basic understanding that holds a country together?
Okay, good. So I think that part of what the question's asking is sort of like this future-oriented view that you're proposing looks like it's leaving the present and the past behind, but that's where all the glue is, right? That's where all the stuff that holds a nation together is. What I want to suggest is that I hear the concern, and I'm not so much opposed to the idea that the task of educating for democratic citizenship involves coming to understand and appreciate facts about democracy's past. What I do want to suggest is that the part of the tradition, let's see if you like this thought, that part of the tradition that holds a particular democracy, maybe the one that we're living in right now, part of the tradition of that democracy is the tradition of trying to innovate new thoughts about how we can move towards a better realization of the idea of a self-governing community of equals. That's part of that the very idea that we are invested in that forward-looking, creative process is part of the tradition. That's the kind of answer I would want to give.
Hi, I'm also a Madeline.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot of us. But my question is, since not everyone goes to college/university, and there is a political divide in who goes into higher education, how do we spread academic freedom and academic responsibility to high schools or people that don't go to a four-year university?
So I got a couple of things, a couple of thoughts here. I think that much of what I said here, although I did tend to focus on professors and institutions of higher learning, I don't think it's very difficult to see that a similar kind of account can be constructed, particularly around grade education and secondary education above, K through 3 or 4 or something like this. And the disappearance across the country, and here the data, I'm sure there are people in the audience now who know more about this, know more about the data than I do, although I know a little bit about it. The data with regard about the decline of civics classes in secondary school, right, in high school, junior high. It's really interesting, and I think it's an interesting set of data, and I think that it suggests a real period of divestment in the culture of the overt idea that education is not simply about contributing to one's society in a brutally economic sense of contributing, right? But that it's also understanding the institutions, coming to appreciate what's in the Constitution, and that those initiatives have recently been resuscitated in a way that tends to be, I should say, overtly connected to conservative political projects in the country. Is another element to this that I think is, the civic leadership centers and things that pop up, usually funded by private money at institutions all over the country. There's a sense in which I'm like, good. But that we've given up on this, I think, is part of the broader story, and that we at some point had begun thinking that colleges and universities were the places where education becomes liberal in the sense of liberal education, sort of liberating the mind and all the rest, and that high school is a kind of skills training. I think that that's part of the story too. That I would also, in a longer version of a talk like this, would want to point to as a place to criticize. Does that sound all right?
Can we thank our speaker?
Thank you.